Countries don't collapse because they are invaded. They collapse because they are constrained. Armies can destroy cities, but debt can shape decisions. Invasions are visible. Debt is procedural. And history shows something far less dramatic, but far more enduring. The most powerful nations in the world did not always lose control through force. They often surrendered flexibility through obligation. For most of human history, power had a physical form. Empires expanded by marching across borders. Territory signaled strength. Resources signaled dominance. Gold filled treasuries and funded legions. If a ruler wanted influence, he deployed soldiers. But war has always carried a cost. Armies require logistics. Supply chains stretch thin. Occupation breeds resistance. And prolonged campaigns drain treasuries faster than they expand borders. Eventually, political authorities discovered something more scalable than invasion: credit. Lending did not require permanent occupation. It did not require garrisons. It did not require rebuilding what was destroyed. It required signatures. In early modern Europe, sovereign borrowing began to transform statecraft. Monarchs increasingly relied on financiers to fund wars and naval expansion. Tax revenues were no longer sufficient, so rulers borrowed against future income. At first, this appeared to be a tool of strength. Debt allowed states to act faster than their revenues would normally permit. It enabled long wars. It financed exploration. It accelerated infrastructure. But borrowing carries an asymmetry because debt creates hierarchy. The borrower depends on the lender's continued confidence. The borrower must maintain credibility. The borrower must signal stability. And when nations borrow, they do not simply owe currency. They owe reassurance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, organized financial centers began to professionalize sovereign lending. Capital moved across borders. Governments in fiscal distress turned to external creditors. Loans increasingly came with expectations: balanced budgets, customs oversight, spending discipline, administrative reform. Influence no longer required a flag planted on foreign soil. It required a balance sheet. A nation could remain sovereign in name, its anthem unchanged, its parliament intact, while key economic levers were quietly shaped by creditors. Debt rarely announces itself as domination. It arrives as assistance. It comes with contracts, not cannons, with restructuring agreements, not regiments. The 20th century did not dismantle this structure. It industrialized it. Two world wars devastated economies. Reconstruction required capital on an unprecedented scale. Borrowing expanded globally. International financial institutions emerged to coordinate and stabilize this new order. Bond markets deepened and interconnected. Debt became normalized. Governments no longer borrowed only in crisis. They borrowed in anticipation. They borrowed to stimulate. They borrowed to smooth political cycles. They borrowed to promise growth before growth had materialized. Future revenue was spent in advance. Deficits shifted from emergency tools to structural features. As long as economies expanded faster than liabilities, the system appeared sustainable. Growth masked fragility. But mathematics is indifferent to optimism. If debt compounds faster than output, the burden gradually intensifies. Interest payments consume increasing portions of public budgets. Policy flexibility narrows. Choices become constrained not by ideology, but by arithmetic. Healthcare competes with debt service. Infrastructure competes with debt service. Defense competes with debt service. And debt service rarely negotiates. Today, most developed nations operate with permanent sovereign debt. Old obligations are refinanced with new issuance. Maturity schedules are extended. Central banks influence borrowing costs through monetary policy. Markets evaluate fiscal decisions in real time. A credit rating downgrade can raise borrowing costs overnight. Bond yields respond within minutes. Currency markets adjust instantly. Voters deliberate slowly. Markets react immediately. Speed has become a dimension of power. Debt does not need conspiracy to shape outcomes. It requires continuity. When investors question sustainability, borrowing costs rise. When borrowing costs rise, fiscal pressure increases. When fiscal pressure increases, governments adjust. Taxes rise, spending falls. Public promises are recalibrated, not because of invasion, because of obligation. Modern governments rarely default outright. Outright collapse is disruptive and politically destabilizing. Instead, they manage perception. They renegotiate timelines. They refinance maturities. They allow moderate inflation to erode real liabilities. They shift burdens across generations. The system persists, but sovereignty shifts subtly. This shift is rarely dramatic. It does not resemble the fall of a capital city. It resembles a narrowing corridor. The greater the leverage, the smaller the margin for error. Debt itself is not inherently destructive. It can finance transformative infrastructure. It can stabilize economies during crisis. It can prevent immediate collapse. It can buy time. But time purchased with borrowing is still borrowed time. History reveals a recurring structure. Crisis leads to borrowing. Borrowing leads to normalization. Normalization leads to structural dependence. Dependence limits optionality. Optionality is power. When policy options shrink, autonomy contracts. Empires once feared siege engines. Today they monitor yield curves. In earlier centuries, control required physical presence. Now it requires financial exposure. Global capital is mobile. Governments are not. This asymmetry matters. If a nation becomes reliant on external financing, its room for independent maneuvering diminishes. Budget decisions must account for investor sentiment. Long-term strategy must consider short-term market reaction. This is not overt domination, it is structural influence. The system does not need villains, it functions through incentives. Creditors seek stability and repayment. Governments seek funding and growth. Markets seek return. Within that triangle, sovereignty becomes negotiated. Countries do not collapse because they are invaded. They collapse because they become constrained beyond adjustment. Constraint precedes crisis. When flexibility disappears, fragility increases. When fragility increases, shocks become destabilizing. Debt is not a weapon in the traditional sense. It does not fire, it does not explode, but it amplifies leverage, and leverage reshapes behavior. Across centuries, the pattern persists. Forms evolve. Institutions modernize. Technology accelerates transactions. But compounding remains constant. History does not shout its warnings. It embeds them in balance sheets. Systems built on permanent compounding obligations eventually encounter limits. Sometimes those limits appear as inflation, sometimes as austerity, sometimes as stagnation, sometimes as political realignment. The mechanism differs. The constraint is consistent. The critical question is not whether debt exists. Debt will always exist. The question is who ultimately defines its terms. Who sets the conditions? Who absorbs the risk? Who adjusts when growth slows? History suggests that borrowers rarely dictate those terms indefinitely. Power has not disappeared from global politics. It has migrated. From battlefields to bond markets, from fortresses to financial contracts, from visible conquest to negotiated obligation, countries do not collapse because they are invaded. They collapse when accumulated constraints exceed their capacity to adapt. Debt is not destiny, but unmanaged leverage narrows futures. And nations, like individuals, operate differently when their choices shrink. The lesson is not fear, it is awareness. Because in the modern world, sovereignty is not only defended at borders, it is defended in budgets. If you want historical analysis that goes beyond headlines, beyond personalities and into structures, subscribe.